She was forced to dance for the Outlaws, until the loner rancher threw his coat over her shoulders. The saloon doors swung open with a violent crash, letting in a gust of desert wind that carried the scent of dust and danger. Clara Whitman's fingers tightened around the wooden tray she carried, her knuckles white against the chipped ceramic cups that rattled with her trembling. She'd been serving drinks at the Broken Spur Saloon for 3 months now, ever since her father's death had left her with nothing but debts and desperation. But tonight felt different. Tonight the air crackled with a menace she'd never experienced before. Through the batwing doors strode 5 men whose very presence seemed to darken the amber glow of the oil lamps. Their faces were weathered leather, marked by violence and hardship, and their eyes held the cold gleam of predators. The lead man, tall and lean with a scar running from his left temple to his jaw, surveyed the room like a king claiming his domain. His name was Jake Brennan, though most folks knew him better as the leader of the Brennan Gang, a group of outlaws who'd been terrorizing the territory for the better part of 2 years. Well, Brennan drawled, his voice carrying the lazy confidence of a man accustomed to getting his way. "Looks like we found ourselves a fine establishment for the evening, boys." The other patrons, mostly local cowboys and a few traveling merchants, seemed to shrink into themselves, suddenly finding their drinks far more interesting than the newcomers. Clara knew she should retreat to the kitchen, should make herself invisible, but her feet felt rooted to the sawdust-covered floor. Brennan's pale blue eyes found her across the room, and his thin lips curved into a smile that made her stomach turn. "You there, girl? Bring us a bottle of your finest whiskey. Make it 2 bottles." Clara nodded quickly, grateful for an excuse to move, to do something with her hands. She hurried to the bar where old Pete, the barkeeper, was already reaching for the bottles with shaking hands. "You best stay in the back room, Miss Clara," Pete whispered urgently. "These ain't the kind of men who take no for an answer." But before Clara could respond, Brennan's voice boomed across the saloon. "Actually, on second thought, forget the whiskey for now. Boys, it's been a long, dusty trail and I think we deserve some entertainment." He stood up slowly, his chair scraping against the floor with an ominous sound. "You girl, yes, you with the pretty brown hair, come here." Clara's heart hammered against her ribs as every eye in the saloon turned to her. She clutched the whiskey bottles to her chest like a shield. "I need to serve the drinks, sir. The drinks can wait." Brennan's voice had lost its lazy drawl, replaced by something harder, more dangerous. "I said come here." When Clara hesitated, one of Brennan's men, a stocky brute with missing teeth, stood up and started toward her. The threat was clear. Clara set down the bottles with trembling hands and walked across the room, each step feeling like she was walking toward her own execution. "That's better," Brennan said when she stopped a few feet away from their table. "Now we've been riding hard for days, and we're in need of some entertainment. You look like a girl who knows how to dance." I don't dance, sir," Clara managed to say, her voice barely above a whisper. Brennan's laugh was harsh and without humor. "Oh, but I think you do. Charlie, give us some music." The man with missing teeth pulled out a harmonica and began playing a jaunty tune that seemed obscene in the tense atmosphere of the saloon. The other outlaws began clapping and stomping their feet, their eyes never leaving Clara's face. "Dance," Brennan commanded, his hand resting meaningfully on the butt of his pistol. Clara looked around the saloon desperately, hoping someone, anyone, would step forward to help her. But the other patrons avoided her gaze, their faces etched with shame and fear. Even old Pete had disappeared into the back room. She was alone. With tears threatening to spill down her cheeks, Clara began to move awkwardly to the music, her movements stiff and reluctant. The outlaws whooped and hollered, their appreciation crude and demeaning. Brennan leaned back in his chair, a satisfied smirk on his scarred face. "That's it, darling. Put some spirit into it now." The harmonica wheezed out its tinny melody, and Clara forced herself to keep moving, to keep dancing, even as humiliation burned in her chest like acid. She closed her eyes, trying to transport herself somewhere else, anywhere else but this smoke-filled saloon with these terrible men. Then, over the sound of the music and the outlaws' catcalls, she heard the soft jingle of spurs approaching the saloon doors. The doors swung open again, this time without violence, and in walked a man who seemed to carry the vast silence of the desert with him. He was tall and broad-shouldered, with dark hair that curled slightly at his collar and eyes the color of storm cloud. His face was tanned and weathered, but there was something in his bearing that spoke of education and refinement, even beneath the dust of the trail. A Colt .45 hung low on his hip, worn smooth from use, and his clothes, while practical, were of better quality than most men in these parts could afford. Clara had seen him before, though they'd never spoken. He was Thomas "Tom" Mackenzie, a rancher who owned a spread about 10 miles outside of town. Folks said he kept to himself, that he'd come from back east with money and secrets, though no one knew the details. He rarely came to town, and when he did, he conducted his business quickly and quietly before disappearing back into the desert. Tom stopped just inside the doors, his gray eyes taking in the scene before him. The harmonica music faltered and died as Charlie noticed the newcomer. The outlaw's attention shifted from Clara to this unexpected interruption. Well, Brennan said, though his voice had lost some of its earlier confidence. Look what the wind blew in. You lost, stranger. Tom's gaze moved slowly around the room, taking in the frightened faces of the other patrons, the outlaw's threatening postures, and finally settling on Clara, who had stopped dancing and stood frozen in the center of the room. Something flickered in his eyes. Anger perhaps, or recognition of an injustice that needed correcting. Just came in for a drink, Tom said quietly, his voice carrying a slight accent that suggested education and distant places. Didn't realize there was a show going on. Brennan's eyes narrowed. Well, you're welcome to watch, friend. This little lady was just entertaining us with her dancing. Weren't you, sweetheart? Clara opened her mouth to speak, but no words came out. The shame and fear had stolen her voice. Tom stepped further into the saloon, his movements deliberate and controlled. Seems to me the lady might be tired. Dancing's hard work. Dancing's what we're paying her for, Brennan replied, his hand moving closer to his gun. Ain't none of your concern, stranger. Maybe. Tom walked to the bar, seemingly unconcerned by the tension crackling in the air. Pete, I'll take a whiskey. The good stuff. Old Pete emerged from the back room, his face pale but relieved to see Tom. With shaking hands he poured a glass of whiskey and set it on the bar. Tom picked up the glass but didn't drink. Instead he turned to face the outlaws, leaning casually against the bar. You boys from around here? We're from wherever we want to be from, the stocky outlaw with the harmonica said belligerently. Interesting philosophy, Tom replied mildly, though I find that men who respect the local customs tend to get along better in small towns like this one. Brennan stood up slowly, his chair scraping against the floor. And what customs might those be, strange? Well, Tom said, taking a small sip of his whiskey, around here we don't usually force ladies to dance against their will. Bad for business, you understand. Makes folks uncomfortable. The silence that followed was heavy with threat. Clara could feel the violence building in the room like pressure before a thunderstorm. She wanted to tell Tom to leave, to save himself, but she couldn't find her voice. You calling us uncivilized? Brennan's voice was deadly quiet. Tom shrugged. I'm just saying that where I come from, a gentleman asks a lady if she'd like to dance, and if she says no, he respects her answer. Well, stranger, you ain't where you come from anymore. Brennan's hand now rested fully on his gun butt. And this ain't no lady. This is just a saloon girl who's doing what she's paid to do. Tom's gray eyes hardened. I think you're mistaken. The confrontation might have escalated into gunplay right then, but Clara finally found her voice. Please, she said, looking between the two men. I was just finishing anyway. She started to move toward the bar, desperate to get away from the center of attention, but Brennan's voice stopped her. Oh no, darling, we ain't nearly done with you yet. In fact, I think it's time you gave us a private show upstairs. The threat in his words was unmistakable, and Clara felt the blood drain from her face. She looked at Tom, her eyes pleading, though she had no right to expect help from a stranger. Tom set his whiskey glass down on the bar with a soft click. I think the ladies had enough entertainment for one evening, and I think you need to mind your own business before you find yourself in more trouble than you can handle. Brennan's gun was halfway out of its holster now. Gentlemen, Tom said quietly, straightening up from the bar, I'm going to make you an offer. The lady looks tired, and I think she's earned a rest. Why don't you let her go on home, and I'll buy you boys a bottle of the good whiskey to show there's no hard feeling. And if we ain't interested in your offer, the stocky outlaw asked, his hand also moving toward his weapon. Tom's expression didn't change, but there was something in his posture that shifted, like a wolf preparing to spring. Then I reckon we'll have to discuss it differently. Clara realized she was holding her breath. The entire saloon seemed to be balanced on a knife's edge, waiting for the first move that would send everything spiraling into violence. It was then that Tom did something completely unexpected. Instead of reaching for his gun, he shrugged out of his long brown coat, a well-made duster that had seen many miles of desert travel. Without taking his eyes off Brennan, he walked slowly across the room to where Clara stood frozen. "Here," he said gently, draping the coat over her shoulder. The garment was warm from his body heat, and carried the scent of leather and sage. "You look cold." The simple gesture was like a declaration of war. By placing his coat on her shoulders, Tom was claiming protection over her, marking her as under his care. In the code of the West it was a line drawn in the sand. Brennan's face flushed red with rage. "You son of a—" His gun cleared leather first, but Tom was fast. The Colt appeared in his hand as if by magic, the barrel already leveled at Brennan's chest while the outlaw's weapon was still rising. "I wouldn't," Tom said softly. The other outlaws had started to draw their guns as well, but they froze when they saw how quickly Tom had moved. In the space of a heartbeat, the situation had reversed completely. "Now," Tom continued, his voice still calm but carrying an edge of steel, "I think you boys have had enough excitement for one evening. Why don't you finish your drinks and head on to wherever you're going next?" Brennan's gun remained half drawn, his face twisted with fury and humiliation. "You think you're fast enough to take all 5 of us? I think I'm fast enough to take you," Tom replied. "And that's all that matters, isn't it? You're the one who makes the decisions for this group." The truth of that statement hung in the air. In any gang, the leader's authority depended on respect and fear. If Brennan backed down from a single man, especially in front of his own crew, his leadership would be called into question. But Tom had positioned himself perfectly. He stood slightly to one side, using Clara as partial cover while keeping his gun trained on Brennan. Even if the other outlaws tried to draw, they'd risk hitting their own leader. "This ain't over," Brennan said finally, slowly holstering his weapon. "I hope it is," Tom replied. "For your sake." Brennan jerked his head toward the door. "Come on, boys, this place ain't worth our time anyway." The outlaws filed out reluctantly, their pride wounded but their lives intact. Brennan was the last to leave, pausing at the door to look back at Tom and Clara. "I'll remember you, stranger. Both of you. I'm counting on it," Tom said quietly. After the outlaws left, the saloon remained silent for a long moment. Then, gradually, conversation resumed as the other patrons tried to pretend that nothing unusual had happened. But Clara could feel their eyes on her, and she knew that what had just occurred would be the talk of the town for weeks to come. She realized she was still wearing Tom's coat, and she started to remove it. "Thank you," she began, but he held up a hand to stop her. "Keep it for now," he said. "You're shaking." She was. The delayed reaction to the danger was setting in, and she could feel tremors running through her entire body. The coat was heavy and warm, and wearing it made her feel protected in a way she hadn't felt since her father's death. "I should get back to work," she said, though the thought of serving drinks and pretending normalcy seemed impossible. "Pete," Tom called to the barkeeper, who had emerged from the back room, "I think Miss Clara could use the rest of the evening off." Of course," Pete agreed quickly. "Miss Clara, you go on home, I'll manage fine." "But the money," Clara started. "I'll cover her wages for tonight," Tom said, pulling out a silver dollar and placing it on the bar. "And I think she could use an escort home. Those men might still be around." Clara looked up at him, trying to read his expression. His face was calm now, the deadly intensity of the confrontation faded, but she could see intelligence in his gray eyes, and something else, a sadness that seemed old and deep. "You don't have to do that," she said. "I've been taking care of myself for months now." "I'm sure you have," Tom replied. "But those men aren't going to forget what happened here tonight, and they're not the type to forgive a slight to their pride." The truth of his words sent a chill through her. She'd been so focused on getting through the immediate danger that she hadn't thought about the consequences. The Brennan gang wasn't known for their mercy, and she'd just become a symbol of their humiliation. "What have I done?" she whispered, the full weight of her situation beginning to sink in. Tom's expression softened slightly. "You didn't do anything wrong. Sometimes trouble finds people whether they're looking for it or not." He picked up his whiskey and finished it in one swallow. "Come on, I'll walk you home." They left the saloon together, Clara still wrapped in his coat. The night air was cool and filled with the sound of crickets and distant coyotes. The main street of Cedar Ridge was quiet, most honest folks already in their homes for the evening. I live just behind the general store, Clara said, pointing down the street. It's not far. They walked in silence for a few minutes, their footsteps echoing softly on the wooden sidewalk. Clara kept glancing at the man beside her, trying to understand why he'd risked his life for a stranger. "Why did you do it?" she asked finally. Tom was quiet for so long that she thought he might not answer. When he finally spoke, his voice was distant, as if he were seeing something far away. "I had a sister once," he said. "She was about your age when she died. Beautiful, like you, smart, too. She wanted to be a teacher." Clara waited for him to continue, sensing that this was something he rarely talked about. She was traveling to California with her husband when their wagon train was attacked by outlaws. The men, they didn't just take the money and supplies, they took her too. Her husband tried to stop them, but he was just one man against a dozen. "I'm sorry," Clara said softly. They found her body 3 days later. Tom's voice was matter of fact, but Clara could hear the pain underneath. The things they'd done to her. Well, no one should have to die like that. They'd reached the small boarding house where Clara rented a room. She stopped at the bottom of the steps leading to the front door, not wanting their conversation to end. "Is that why you came out here, to find them?" Tom shook his head. "Found them 2 years ago. All 12 of them." The simple statement carried a weight that made Clara shiver. She didn't ask what had happened to them. She didn't need to. "So why did you stay?" Tom looked up at the star-filled sky. "Sometimes a man needs to forget who he used to be. This seems like a good place for that." Clara started to remove his coat again, but he stopped her with a gentle touch on her shoulder. "Keep it tonight," he said. "Those men might come back, and I want them to know you're under my protection. But what about you? Won't that put you in danger?" Tom's smile was grim. "Miss Clara, I've been in danger every day for the past 5 years. A little more won't make much difference." He tipped his hat to her. "Good night, and don't worry about going to work tomorrow. I have a feeling Pete won't expect you for a few days." As he started to walk away, Clara called after him, "Mr. Mackenzie, will I see you again?" He paused, looking back at her. "I expect so. Cedar Ridge isn't that big a town." Clara watched him disappear into the darkness, his spurs jingling softly with each step. Then she climbed the stairs to her room, still wearing his coat, still carrying the warmth and scent of the man who'd saved her from a fate she didn't want to imagine. Inside her small room, she sat on the edge of her narrow bed and finally allowed herself to cry, not just from fear and relief, but from a complicated mixture of emotions she didn't fully understand. For months, she'd felt completely alone in the world, struggling to survive day by day. But tonight, a stranger had risked everything to protect her dignity and her safety. She pulled the coat tighter around her shoulders, and thought about Tom Mackenzie, the sadness in his eyes, the deadly speed with which he'd drawn his gun, the gentle way he'd placed the coat over her shoulders. There was a story there, layers of pain and loss and perhaps redemption. And despite the danger that still lurked in the shadows, Clara found herself hoping that their paths would cross again. Outside her window she could hear the sound of horses leaving town at a gallop, the Brennan gang, moving on to whatever violence awaited them down the trail. But Clara knew that Tom was right. They wouldn't forget what had happened tonight. She'd become a part of their story now just as they'd become a part of hers. She lay down on the bed without undressing, still wrapped in Tom's coat. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new fear. But tonight, for the first time in months, she felt protected. The coat was like armor against the world, a tangible reminder that someone cared enough to stand between her and harm. As she drifted off to sleep, Clara's last conscious thought was a prayer that when morning came, the coat's protection would be enough to keep the darkness at bay. Little did she know that this was just the beginning of a story that would test them both in ways they couldn't imagine, but would ultimately lead to something neither had dared hope for in their darkest hours. The desert wind howled outside her window, carrying with it the promise of storms to come, but for now, Clara slept peacefully, wrapped in the warmth of an unexpected hero's care.